Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Judd. One thing that I'm keeping in mind that I'm happy about is there will be no talk about how might we's in this one. But there is a trigger warning in that I will mention the R word. So I do want to continue this conversation around impact. And I'm going to make the assumption that for many of us, actually, impact is one of the very reasons why we've chosen to do the work that we do. So meaning, wanting to affect change, wanting to improve experiences in some way, wanting to make things easier for people. To that extent, when we're thinking about impact, this conversation is not really going to be about trying to convince anyone of the impact of their work. It's really going to be more so around, trying to demonstrate impact, approaches to demonstrating that. And so, what I'll talk about today are strategies that I've really borrowed from the behavioral sciences across the work that I've done in health tech, fintech, to demonstrate impact with the teams that I've worked with. One thing that I will say is, I think it's fair to say that sometimes when looking across, the different disciplines represented in this room, as researchers, as designers, as product folks, there can sometimes be this discrepancy or this disconnect between, on the one hand, the research, the insights that we're generating, and then on the other hand, the impact of that work insofar as, how it's assessed by the products, the businesses, right, that we are the context that we're working in. I think it's really important that we anchor around behaviors. So I'll be talking about it from a behavioral lens. The statement might sound pretty intuitive, but I'm going to dig a little bit more deeply into that. So, as a function of having to be performance indicators, a lot of business metrics are outcome metrics, meaning they're a reflection of sort of where businesses would ideally like to sort of end up, right? So what I mean by that is, when we think about, say, business growth, right, as an outcome, it can look like many different things. For, one product, one business, it might mean, new leads, new acquisitions, right? For another, it might mean, much more specifically, for a particular kind of, user or segment, it might mean going to a particular website, then logging in, then, signing up, opting into a particular kind of service. End results of what they'd like to achieve, but it really does distill into particular types of behaviors. Outcomes are a function of behavior. So I'll use another kind of example. We're now in February, so maybe some of us are still holding on to those New Year's resolutions. So say being healthy, healthier, right? That is an outcome. How does one get there? Maybe exercising 3 to 4 times a week, drinking water, eating more balanced meals, going to regular doctor's appointments. Those are now specific behaviors that sort of ladder up to that outcome, some more predictive than others. But again, that broader outcome is a function of specific behaviors. And so when we're going to be talking now around, outcomes like business outcomes, we're going to need to start to distill it down to the specific sort of leading indicators that map onto those. And we have to think about it in the context of behaviors. Why? Because in a lot of the work that we do, we're usually dealing with people, right? And the types of changes that we're trying to affect have to deal with behaviors. So when, talking about this relationship between outcomes and behaviors, I really love the sports metaphor that Hazer Polpacali, one of the executives at Optimizely, uses. So he says measuring every experiment on revenue is like measuring every sports player on points scored. Someone also needs to pass. I love this, right? So he kind of really forces us to have to take this bigger picture view of the entire game. So it's not that focusing on the R word is bad, but rather it's that, yes, success winning is a function of points scored, but at the same time, there may be other types of factors that also predict it, right? Like someone passing, like someone assisting, right? So how many of those points at the latest Warriors versus Lakers game, right, that say Curry scored were a function of someone having to pass that ball, right? And so when we're thinking about outcomes now, we also maybe want to be optimizing for actually a behavioral outcome that's actually the stronger predictor of points scored or of the R word. Something to think about when we're designing, or structuring our research agendas. So I see a couple of smiles. This is maybe triggering some memories. How many of us are familiar with the South Park gnomes? Yes, yeah, it's a good one. So I feel like I can't have a conversation around impact outcomes without sort of resurfacing this one. It's a great one. So I think the original probably aired sometime in the 2000s, but it's just a great, again, kind of way of depicting this problem, right? So if I kind of had to, summarize this and try to do justice, it's an episode of the show South Park that aired in which, there were these gnomes and they were tasked with having to come up with a business plan. And so the gnomes went about and came up with their business plan, right? And when they were challenged to showcase it, they said, yes, we have a business plan. It's really easy. There are 3 phases to it. Phase 1, we're gonna collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit. That makes sense, right? Okay, let's move on. So in the original, I can't recall if the second phase was just dead silence or if maybe there was like kind of the sound of like a record skipping. But the point was that phase 2 was very nebulous. And I'm sure a lot of us have encountered sometimes someone trying to explain a process and they kind of just like skirt over that second part and it's like, yes, yeah. So I'm bringing this up because again, when we're talking about connecting insights to outcomes, sometimes there's a bit of that nebulousness in that second part, much in the same way that sometimes maybe when someone's trying to talk to a behavioral scientist and they're like, yes, connect insights to outcomes, anchor around, behavior, it's very easy. It may feel like what they're saying to you is, phase 1, there's a behavior. Phase 2, jumble, garble. Phase 3, outcomes. And so for this next part, what I'm going to attempt to do is really, upskill us by zoning in a little bit more onto that phase 2 in terms of like, how do we actually get there? How do we actually do that? So a couple of things to keep in mind. And Judd already actually spoke to some of these, right? So, we're already great at being kind of like the voice of users, the voice of customers. And as much as we want to sort of make sure that we're always aligning what we're doing with our members' voices, we also have to make sure that we're aligning with, the business, right? So starting out with trying to understand, what is an outcome that matters to the business. And as I already alluded to, there are going to be specific behaviors, key behaviors that map onto that outcome. So this itself can already become kind of like the research agenda. And there are different ways you can do that. So depending on kind of where you sit within the organization, maybe this is really within your wheelhouse, right? So say you're within analytics, maybe you're in data science, you already know predictive analytics, you can kind of work backwards, right? You can maybe compare the people who are experiencing that outcome to those who aren't, work backwards and sort of look, what are the behaviors that are sort of, kind of separating those 2 paths. Or maybe you're really more within the journeys, right? And you have sort of a sense or a hunch of like maybe key critical sort of paths within their journey that would separate. And so you test, right? The people who are doing that particular behavior versus those who aren't. What do the trajectories look like? But you have to start to distinguish what those behaviors might be. And once you do that, you really want to sort of contextualize them. And again, this is the kind of stuff that we're really good at. But in terms of what we're really starting to want to do is understand the drivers of those behaviors. Why? Because in terms of making actionable recommendations, we want to figure out what are the levers that we can start to pull so that we can drive behaviors and have impact. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then finally, we're not just generating insights for the sake of insights, right? Someone said insights just lead to more insights, but no behavioral change, right? Ultimately, we are trying to affect change through behaviors. And in order to understand change, we need to know where we started. So I think some brilliant, wise person, but probably is no longer alive, said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And if you can't improve it, you can't understand impact. So we want to understand where we started in order to then understand where we are, to then compare that difference, right? To understand the change. So a little bit more about me. I currently lead behavioral research at Voya Financial, where our team, we leverage behavioral science, analytics, insights to try to optimize people's decision-making around their health and wealth outcomes. So think things like retirement savings, benefit elections. And so I'm going to, again, in the spirit of trying to zoom into that phase 2, give you kind of a high level example of like what that process might look like, but trying to keep it very process level and agnostic, because again, what we're doing is we're focusing kind of at the behavioral level. How might we take an approach that's behavior first, right, to lend us to shifting outcomes? So think of this as kind of like a standard, 401k enrollment process. And because we want to take a behavioral approach where behaviors are really key, tracking of behaviors is always really important, right? And again, depending on kind of where you sit within your organization, this might be something that you are kind of familiar with. And if not, take it as an opportunity to start to identify what are the types of cross-functional relationships that you may want to leverage, right, to be able to have this vantage point. But really, I think it's also just basic good product and service hygiene to always have an understanding of like, how are your customers, your users sort of going across your experience? What are the trends looking like? What are the drop-off moments looking like? So as you can see, lots of different types of steps in this process, lots of different types of behaviors. And again, we want to understand what are those sort of key behaviors that are most predictive of our business outcome. And say our business outcome is we want to get more people to enroll from the business sense, because we know from a customer lens, people want to build a nest egg, right? They want more financial confidence, because we also know that one of the biggest causes of people's stress is financial stress. So if you want to marry those things together, we figure out that maybe the contribution step, right, within this enrollment period is where people get stuck. We also know that it's one of the stronger predictors of that broader outcome. We want to zoom in there to figure out, okay, how might we sort of get people a little bit unstuck so they can go through this process? Judd alluded to one of our strengths is we have a lot of methods within our toolkit, right? So I'm not going to say that there's a specific one we have to reach towards. Some of us, it may look like a survey. It may look like interviews. It may look like, a diary study. It may look like usability testing. It's really more of those different types of feedback that we have or that we can get. How do we now start to dissect either themes or ask specific types of questions that'll have us have an understanding of drivers of that behavior that we want to be promoting? So again, don't forget, secondary research is something that we often tend to not look into, but it's available. It's really, in terms of like costs and time, it's just something that we want to keep in mind. We can also leverage within our toolkit. But in terms of the drivers of behaviors, how might we think about sort of categorizing them, right? What are we looking for? Well, if people are getting stuck at a particular point, or if you want to sort of drive a particular behavior, to what degree, are we finding that it's related to capability, right? Do they have sufficient information at that point? To what degree is it related to opportunity, right? Is it environmental in some way? To what degree might it be related to actually their motivation, right? Is it motivational? Do they understand the value of even doing this behavior at a particular point? So what I'm slowly building up to here is actually widely known and very evidence-based approach that's called the COMBI model. And why I'm sharing it is, again, in the spirit of sort of, up-leveling us. I also find it very fairly accessible. It's been applied across a variety of different types of behaviors, both behaviors that people may be driving that happen in one instance or in a repeated type of fashion. But what it essentially posits is that behavior is a function of these three components, right? Capability, opportunity, and motivation. And that when we're sort of looking across, say, an experience, right, where we see someone might get stuck, the degree to which it's a function of any of those sort of three drivers helps us sort of identify, where might we want to intervene or, introduce sort of a solution to help drive a behavior. So again, when we're thinking about actionable insights, right, this is a framework, a behavioral framework that we could use that also is evidence-based and comes with some solutions that can help us guide our teams and have broader impact. So you might be wondering at this point, well, how do I convert this knowledge into, from an insight into a solution or an intervention? That's the other nice advantage to the COMBI model, particularly if you're maybe new to this or working with a team where there's sort of varying degree of familiarity or experience with kind of going from insight to interventions. The COMBI model also has, lots of prior research and evidence that has sort of identified what they call design features or solutions that also map onto these various barriers. So you might think of this as, across that top section, different types of categories of solutions like education, training, persuasion, incentives, coercion, that have different varying levels of impact according to, say, if there's a barrier related to capability, opportunity, or motivation. And in fact, once I shared this to a group of people, there was a lawyer in the back who raised his hand and he was like, I never thought of it this way, but actually that's a lot of how we think about this in law with certain behaviors like crime, in terms of, someone could have a lot of motivation to want to engage in a crime or a lot of capability, but they just don't have the opportunity or the means. And so they wouldn't. Or similarly, they could have a lot of motivation, have a lot of opportunity, but they just don't have sort of like the mental capacity or capability to do so. Or as I like to think of it too, they could have very little motivation, a lot of opportunity, or very little capability, and still shoplift, a la, what was her name? Does anyone know who I'm referring to? Winona Ryder. Yes. So again, from the solutioning, we'll have lots of different sort of ideas. We can brainstorm. But I think in terms of now understanding how those things actually manifest in terms of driving behavior, this is where experiments can be a powerful sort of tool within our skill set to leverage. And really the value of experiments is that it is one of the only methods that allows us to have confidence in terms of understanding the specific impact that a solution that we've introduced has on a behavioral outcome. But again, our strength and our advantage, even if we can't go through the technical piece of the experimentation, is that leveraging the insights that we're bringing is really important to the experimental process. Hypotheses are also important. And so if I can impart anything or give anything to all of us in this group, it's kind of this template that I've used with different teams. And if you kind of look at it, it should be following kind of this flow that I've already been sharing with you, right? So for example, starting out with this broader business outcome that we know matters to the business, distilling it down to a specific behavior that we know is kind of like a leading predictor of that outcome. Understanding what are sort of the barriers or drivers of that specific behavior, then thinking about, well, what might we introduce, right, to now drive that behavior in a particular way? So our solution or our intervention. And then thinking about, okay, so what's the behavioral outcome that will result of this? How might we measure this? And in that measurement, that's also how we start to understand, well, how are we going to establish the baseline so that we know it's the before and then the after to set up kind of this experimental design. And then finally, the impact, right? So there's going to be a behavioral outcome, which is kind of the more immediate impact that it has, but then there are going to be the downstream effects, which presumably include things like that broader, longer term business outcome, but then there could be other things too. And it's setting up your experimental design, and sometimes this even could be part of your deliverable. But also if you want to pursue kind of going into more of the technical experimental piece, then you may, if this is kind of more of a stretch, you may partner with another cross-functional partner into doing the more kind of experimental piece in and of itself. But measurability, remember, is kind of key. So we are changing human behaviors. So figuring out like what is that behavior that we want to drive. And then as I said, what makes this approach so impactful or allows us to understand impact is because it allows us to have confidence in the specific things that we are manipulating and their unique impact on behavior. So without having to go into kind of specifics around why, like there are a lot of components about this particular method that allows us to do that and allows us to have that confidence. But, one of them being, for example, that we've already have an understanding of that baseline, right? Of which we can then compare kind of the novelty that we're introducing. There are other elements too, like the fact that we want to introduce randomization. And then finally, making sure, and Judd alluded to that, right? That we want to have power. So making sure that we also have the right sizing. And I just alluded to the last two pieces. When we're thinking about impact, sometimes it's going to come at us like this big question, like, what is the impact? Like there's one answer to it. And my recommendation, what I found is helpful, is you can break it up into multiple responses, right? The first being, remember, you can think of it as kind of what is the behavioral change that you're observing or that you're introducing as a function of your insights or of your solutions or interventions. And then how does that behavioral change sort of connect to a more downstream, broader business outcome? So remember, starting with the behavioral outcome, its downstream effect, the two pieces. So it's going to be an outcome question, but I do want to really stress it is a behavioral process first. Thank you.